Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome back to SG Angling. My name is Sam Gaza, and today we're going to be doing an episode on everything weather and how it relates to fishing. Now, before I begin, I would like to introduce my guest today, which is, believe it or not, my dad, and his name is Bob Gaza. He has a PhD in atmospheric science, and he's actually a meteorologist for a living. So, Dad, thanks for coming on today. I appreciate it. And before we begin, maybe you could just give maybe a real brief background about yourself and what you do on an everyday basis and how you got into weather in the first place.
Well, in terms of the beginnings, I loved weather from age 7 or earlier, and when my father and mother gave me a weather kit, and I love snow, and I always wanted to be able to forecast snow, and I followed all the meteorologists on TV and radio. Eventually, I found out that you could go to school for meteorology, and so I decided to go to Northern Illinois University, and then when I completed studies there, my advisor at the time gave me a selection of 5 schools, and I decided that the school with the most snow was the one I was going to, and so I ended up at State University of New York at Albany, in Albany, New York, and so I did my graduate studies there. Then I went back to school to complete my degree, and currently I am working for New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and we forecast general weather for the state of New York, and we give our forecast to various agencies throughout the state, and then the state uses that weather information to prepare for emergencies. And we also forecast air pollution. For New York State, we issue advisories for all of New York State, including New York City and Buffalo, where the pollution levels tend to be highest. And we do other things as well in addition to that.
Well, that's pretty interesting. So, and obviously you've been a fisherman for most of your life. You know, your dad, Poppy, used to take you fishing all the time up in Canada, and we all know that weather plays a really big part into fishing and how the fish feed and how they, interact in the water and how you can catch them. So, and I think center and part and parcel of that is fronts, cold fronts, warm fronts. So maybe you could just brush upon, before we talk about fronts, what is a front and what is going on in the upper atmosphere when a front rolls through?
Well, a front is associated with a low pressure system, and perhaps you've seen on the nightly news the low pressure and high pressure systems that the local meteorologists may put on the weather map, and each low pressure system is associated with a front or 2 fronts or 3 fronts, and as each low pressure system passes by, a front passes with it, and each front each low pressure system is associated with a wave in the jet stream. So the jet stream is the strongest winds in the upper atmosphere, and the low pressure systems form in advance of a wave in the jet stream, and then those waves move through the jet stream, and as each wave passes by, a low pressure system passes by, and then a trailing cold front will also pass by, and again possibly other fronts, including warm fronts or what they call occluded fronts, and each one of those fronts then will pass through regions to the east and south of the low pressure system. In the warm time of the year, the low pressure systems tend to track north of, I live in New York State, so they tend to track north of New York State, though not always, but and most of the time north of New York State, because that's where the jet stream is typically located in the warm season. And as each wave passes through north of New York State in the jet stream, then as that low pressure system passes through, a front will pass through. Now the cold front is the one that is most commonly it's most well known and has perhaps the most radically changing weather with it. And so as the low pressure system passes, a cold front will pass through New York State, and that front is often associated with clouds and precipitation and wind shifts from southerly to westerly or northwesterly. And perhaps most importantly is that near a front you have pressure. The pressure is lowest near a front and higher on either side of the front. So as that front goes through, the pressure will be falling before the front arrives, and as the front passes through, the pressure will begin to rise. So the front marks the point of lowest pressure. So that, in a nutshell, are fronts.
So you talk about pressure. So basically it tends to be falling just prior to when a front comes through, and then after the front passes, you'll see that pressure often increase, and that's when you see the skies will clear out, and that's when it gets really sunny. Is that correct?
Yeah, each front has its own unique characteristics, and that's the nature of weather. You can't necessarily say every front is going to have the same conditions associated with it. However, most frequently, as a front approaches, it's going to be cloudy, or clouds will be on the increase. Even in the middle of summer, there'll be some thunderstorms perhaps developing along the front. The front also serves as a lifting mechanism so that it lifts the air, and when air is lifted, the air moisture in that air condenses and you get clouds and precipitation. And then as the front passes through, the air begins to sink. There's a vertical component to the wind, and that vertical component results in sinking air behind the front, and that will tend to dry out the atmosphere, and so that's why you often have sunnier conditions behind the front. Not necessarily immediately behind the front, but more typically, a few hours or even a day or two behind the front, the air gets drier and the clouds tend to dissipate. You get sunny weather.
So what would be considered high pressure? I mean, you see guys that are checking that sometimes. They'll check the moon phases and the cloud and the precipitation, and sometimes you'll see fishermen that'll actually go out and they'll check to see what the pressure is to give them an idea of it. I've seen numbers such as 29, 30, 31 in that range. What would be considered low or high pressure?
Well, standard atmospheric pressure is 29.92 inches, or 1,013.25 millibars. If the pressure is higher than 29.92 inches, then that's higher pressure, and then lower pressure would be, of course, less than that. But what's important to note is that it's not simply the pressure, but the pressure changes that tend to be most influential on fishing conditions. And if there's no pressure change for an extended period, that can be good fishing. And if there's pressure falling, that's even better fishing conditions. And of course, once the pressure begins to rise, fishing tends to deteriorate over time.
So in regards to also fronts, when you have a certain front that might be approaching or one that has just passed, sometimes you get wind changes and wind directions. When you have a front that passes through, where normally is the wind coming from, and will you often see a switch when that when that front passes through?
Yes, again, associated with cold fronts, the wind tends to be southerly ahead of the front. It can be southeast or south-southeast or south-south-southwest. And then as the front approaches, the winds can either be light or can just radically switch from a strong southerly direction to a strong west or northwest direction, sometimes even northerly direction, and that's the direction from which the wind is coming. So again, each front is different, but in general, a switch in wind from south to northwest would be most typical in the northern hemisphere and in New York State where we are.
So we were just talking about fronts as it relates to fishing, and we've obviously seen that fishing always improves, it seems, before the fronts roll through, and always seems to be difficult right after the front, but fishing isn't always good or bad when fronts are rolling through. Sometimes it can be a relation of pressure too. So talk a little bit about how pressure and falling pressure can affect fishing as well.
Yeah, sometimes no pressure change, where you have stagnant conditions over a significant period of time, a few days. Those kind of conditions can also be good for fishing. In addition, we talked about low pressures passing to the north and with the resultant cold front going through after the low pressure system pushes off to the northeast or the east. But if the low pressure system approaches the area or passes just south of the area, pressure falls can also be observed under those conditions, in which case fishing can be quite good. Even if the front passes to your south, you can get extensive cloudiness with that low pressure system approaching, and as it passes to your south and southeast. And so those conditions can be quite good for fishing as well. So the important thing to remember is to keep your eye on your barometer in situations where the pressure is not changing or the pressure is falling. Those are the best conditions.
So you talk about fronts too in terms of different times of year. You have spring, you have summer, fall. Some guys even fish in the winter in the south. Do you have fronts that are maybe more or less common during certain times of the year?
Well, in the warm season, cold fronts are more common simply because the jet stream lifts up to the north and in more northern latitudes, and that causes the low pressure systems to go in that direction as well, to pass to the north. Under those circumstances, cold front passages would be a result, as we described before. In terms of which months of the warm season are cold fronts more frequently seen, on average, it would be early or late in the warm season when the jet stream is stronger. So especially in like April, May, June, the jet stream is still quite strong, sort of a residual effect from the winter time when the jet streams are the strongest and the wind speeds at the upper levels are the strongest. And so if low pressure were to pass to the north, those cold front passages would be more frequent. Whereas if you get into later in the summer, like July, August, and even into early September, the cold fronts, everything moves slower because the jet stream is weaker, and so the frequency of cold front passages would tend to be less than earlier in the season. And then they'll pick up again as you head towards October and so forth. The jet stream will start to increase in strength, and then the frequency of cold fronts would be picking up again. If I could add one other thing, is that every year and every summer and every season is different, and so you can have an unusual pattern in which the jet stream is stronger in July than it typically is, in which case you may have frequent cold front passages. And there can be a June or a May in which the jet stream is forced north due to variations in the jet stream that occur every year. And so you can have very little or few cold front passages. So each year you have to take the averages with a grain of salt, knowing they can be markedly different depending on the year.
Right. So maybe we could take a step back too, and I know you mentioned it before in passing that the jet stream is basically a bunch of winds that are going on in the upper atmosphere, but maybe you could expound a little bit more on what the jet stream is and why weather seems to be affected by what's going on in the jet stream.
Okay, again, the jet stream is the highest velocity winds in the upper atmosphere, and they occur at the what they call the top of the troposphere, which is the weather sphere, or the part of the atmosphere that we experience weather in. And those jet streams, they can be 30,000 feet depending on the time of year. They tend to be higher in the warm season and lower in the cold season, and that's where airplanes like to fly, the commercial jets. That's where they can get a good tailwind and diminish air travel time by doing so. And in any case, the high wind speeds are concentrated in a band that are maybe a few hundred miles wide or less, and that band of winds around the northern hemisphere is called the jet stream. And there can be a secondary jet stream further south, but most frequently it's a single jet stream that is traveling around the northern hemisphere, and that jet stream will dive south, or it varies across the northern hemisphere in terms of its latitude, its location. And again, there's embedded troughs and ridges within that jet stream, and those troughs and ridges are what drive our pressure systems near the surface that we experience on our home barometers. So as a jet stream trough passes by, that's when the low pressure systems pass by, because the jet stream is what causes, the wave in the jet stream is what causes the low pressure system. And once that wave in the jet stream passes by, on the back side of the wave, high pressure system forms.
So I wanted to go back to something you had said too about how you can have some years that are you have a lot more fronts coming through. You have years where there's a lot more precipitation, and it seems that from listening to podcasts of fishermen that are up in the northern portion of the U.S., they had a really wet year early on. I know in New York, where I grew up and where you live now, it was an unbelievably wet beginning of the year, wet spring. And we all know that weather is very cyclical, and of course things change year over year. So is the jet stream affecting that as well? I mean, is it a shift south or north that would cause a pattern to be more wet or to have more precipitation throughout a certain part of the year?
Yes, that's exactly the reason for why it was so wet in New York and in the eastern part of the United States. In that case, again, the low pressure systems and the inclement weather tends to occur in advance of waves in the jet stream. And in certain years or certain months, you can get stuck in a pattern. The jet stream, for whatever reason, becomes persistent in terms of troughs west of your region, and if that occurs where one trough comes in and then is quickly replaced by a second trough to the west of your region, then your region is going to become wet and cloudy, and the weather will become inclement. So that's what happened more recently.
So before we talk about our next topic, which is cloud cover, I wanted to just brush upon wind and wind direction changes, because in fishing, but I think in musky fishing primarily, guys will always talk about how subtle changes in wind direction, like you might have a southerly wind or southwest wind that suddenly changes, and all of a sudden the muskies will go crazy. Or it's not just muskies, but it could be any type of fish. So what causes your wind to switch, and is there any way to maybe see that coming somehow?
Unless you're a meteorologist, the best approach is to go online, and you can go to the National Weather Service, and they can give you traces of barometric pressure and forecast of those traces, and you can also see traces of wind speed and direction. And so again, you can go to your National Weather Service, and where we live, Albany, New York, you can go to National Weather Service, Albany, New York, and Google that, and then you can find on their website traces of barometric pressure and predictions of those traces, as well as wind and wind speed and direction.
So I wanted to brush upon cloud cover as well, because obviously you get clouds that'll roll in when you have any sort of weather system that comes through. Sometimes things will clear out and you get these bluebird sky days, but what are the types of clouds that you can get prior to a weather system moving in, and what have you found in your experience to be the type of clouds that where fishing is the best?
Well, I would say that a continuous cloud cover would be a good day for fishing. Anytime with fish sensitive to sunlight, this is the reason that cloud cover tends to improve fishing. And in addition to falling pressure, the combination of the clouds and the pressure falling, fish become more active, and of course there's other things like moon phases and multiple factors that can affect fishing. But I would say that any kind of clouds that can eliminate or reduce the sunlight can be advantageous. But those clouds in advance of low pressure systems, such as in meteorological terms, the altocumulus or the cirrostratus, altostratus, the continuous type of cloud covers, those tend to do well. I might also add that ahead of a cold front, which is also a good time for fishing, those clouds in advance of the cold front can be vertically developed clouds, which are called cumulus. And unfortunately, in the warm season, when you get a cold front, those cumulus can grow into cumulonimbus, which are thunderclouds, and so that can raise concerns for fishing safety, because anytime you have lightning on the water, you're the highest object in the area on the water, so you can become a target for the lightning. So while fishing can be quite good under those conditions with approaching cumulus or cumulonimbus, the fisherman has to be wary of thunderclouds, and if you see lightning, or if you see or hear thunder in the distance, it's time to get off the water as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because some of the best fishing we had was actually approaching a big thunderstorm rolling through, and we had to make sure that we are off the water too, because not only are you in a metal boat, but you have these long, a lot of times graphite rods that are, anywhere from 6 to 9 feet. You don't want them sticking in the air on top of the water, or else, of course, you can get struck by lightning. So that's a good point about safety. So there's a very big topic I want to talk about, but before I do, one last thing I wanted you to brush on is humidity, because obviously, of course, during the summer, a lot of times before a thunderstorm will approach, you'll notice the air is very kind of thick and heavy, and you can look out on the horizon and almost see like a haze. What causes that, and what would cause it to even dissipate?
One of them, and most commonly, is in the early morning hours when the temperature has been falling over the course of the night. The humidity levels will always rise because, assuming constant moisture, the humidity, or the relative humidity, is the amount of moisture in the air divided by the amount of moisture that could be in the air. And so as the temperature falls, the amount of moisture that could be in the air decreases. And so that ratio of what is in the air divided what could be in the air, that increases. And so relative humidity always increases in the late night, early morning hours, most typically. And then during the daytime, actually humidity levels go down because the temperature is going up typically, and the amount of water vapor that could be in the air increases, and so the relative humidity goes down during the course of the daytime. And then it'll again increase again towards evening as the temperature drops, and that ratio rises.
Of course, one last topic that is very important to not just fishermen but to everybody, and that's climate change. And you see it all over the news. You see it, people talk about it all the time, and really, unfortunately, it's been politicized more than anything. And it's really not a political issue. It's really more of a science issue, and it's relates a lot of us to fishermen, because we want to know, is the weather warming? Is the water temperatures warming? Is it affecting the fish? Is it affecting the way we should fish? So I don't want to spend too long on it, but and I know it's a big task to take on, but maybe in 3 or 4 minutes, just discuss, do we or should we be concerned as fishermen about the weather or the warming of this earth kind of continuing over the foreseeable future? Is this something we should be concerned about?
Well, one thing to say is that climate is always changing, and it has been changing as far back as meteorologists have been able to estimate in days even before thermometers that we've observed, or we've been able to conclude that the climate has changed. And the other thing to remember is that the current climate that we are currently experiencing is not necessarily the ideal climate or is somehow a sacred climate, but that climate that we have today, it may change, and throughout human history, man has always adapted to the climate. What we've seen in the last 150 years is a general warming, but it has warmed in the past as well, and so the question of whether the warming is somehow related to greenhouse gases or other things that man has done, I think most meteorologists would say yes, in part, man has contributed, but the question of whether the earth is in jeopardy or that there's some crisis, I think that's been politicized and overplayed. And so I think it's something that we should all keep an eye on, but in terms of panicking, I think we can rest assured that the earth is not going to be something different than we've experienced in a radical way over the next 50, 100 years. For all we know, the temperature could start to fall, the temperature could level off, or the temperature continue on its very slow rise as it has over the last several decades. We really don't know, and nobody really knows. We can estimate using models, but the models have had a rough time of it over the last 50 years. And so from a fisherman's standpoint, I think it's safe to say that you might be able to prepare for earlier springs and later falls and maybe later turnovers. But beyond that, I think just be prepared for slightly warmer waters, and I think if you do that, I think we'll all be good.
So what you're saying basically is that over the last several decades, the global temperature of the Earth has warmed slightly and the sea levels have risen slightly, but there are so many factors that come into play with weather beyond human intervention that it would be very irresponsible to point your finger per se on one issue and say that that's the reason why the Earth is warming. So when somebody says, it's human intervention, that would, you can't necessarily point your finger to that because there's so many other factors involved.
Yes, that's a good point, is that while most climatologists would, in the science, that are not politically driven climatologists, I think they would all say that man has had an effect on our climate's temperature over the last 150 years. But it is a very complex issue. There are many factors that will affect climate, and many factors that we don't know of that are affecting or have affected climate that we are underestimating or overestimating their impact on climate and their climate sensitivity to those factors. So it is a very complex issue, and there's no simple answers, and if anyone tells you that the science is settled, it may be settled with respect to the fact that temperature has risen and that man has had some input, but beyond that, if you hear that they've said the science is settled, that is, they're not speaking the truth. And the science is never settled. And we might have firm conclusions about things, but we're always open to hearing opposing views and other alternatives. That's what true science is about, is always challenging the mantra of thought. And so yeah, it's a very imprecise as well as an inexact science, and a lot more could be said, but in a nutshell, it's not a simple issue.
Well, really good stuff. I think we kind of covered and scratched the surface on a lot of topics, so I wanted to, of course, thank you once again for coming on and educating the online world about weather as it relates to fishing, and maybe we'll have to do it again sometime. If you are watching this video right now and you like it, if you would just give it a thumbs up, and if you could also subscribe to the channel, and you can follow me on Instagram at SG_angling as well, and I would greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time.